from different countries at different levels have provided a lot of insight to researchers, and obviously research strategists, action strategists have actually responded in their work. Iterating, learning from their own experiences and utilizing this. But a lot of this has gone undocumented and unanalyzed and has failed largely to provide lessons for other places and other locations, both for research and practice. And so it is the responsibility, obviously, of research to take on this agenda, these two gaps, to find research or to provide research and work with practitioners for developing research questions and agendas that are relevant to practitioners, but also helping and working with practitioners to document, provide insights, and help people analyze their own experiences. So with these two sort of questions in mind, I hand over to Professor Jonathan Cox, who is going to sort of frame the bigger picture.
Issue because when we reflected in the researcher assembly earlier today, we noticed that in the charter, the section about research and researchers didn't really address the agenda setting. It was more damage control, how to keep researchers from messing up, as opposed to how researchers can contribute. So I'm going to start with something that is really widespread in the kind of research that is associated with some of the dominant paradigms that gets the most headlines, the occasional Nobel Prize. And the point here is that weak interventions lead to weak outcomes. And I was sitting next to a colleague yesterday who said, we're doing all this very interesting work in central India with all these multiple components, and we're going to have an RCT done. And I said, well, what is the RCT going to measure? Of the many things that you're no doubt doing, what piece of that intervention are they going to measure? What are the indicators? I don't know. Somebody else is doing that. Well, this is an extremely dangerous problem, because what it means is that an organization may be pursuing an extremely creative, multi-level, multifaceted, multi-pronged strategy. And outside group of researchers are going to come in and they're going to measure a small piece of that. And then they're going to find out that that small piece of it didn't actually make a big difference, which is going to cast a dark shadow over all the other much more ambitious and interesting and power-shifting things that they're actually doing. So the point here is that we found, looking across the landscape of these kinds of studies of RCTs in particular, is that they tend to focus on the simplest possible theories of change. That they're very, very brief, we use the term light touch, they do just a little bit for a short period of time. They're extremely bounded locally, only at the most micro of levels, and they really shift the burden to citizens to do all the work, give you a little bit of information, and then you're supposed to overcome centuries of oppression. These kinds of studies also, since they're regression analysis driven, correlation driven, it's all about looking for relationships between variables, which means averaging out, which means washing out all of the variation. And if a change strategy is trying to do anything difficult or complicated, there will be variation. There will be variation in the degree of intensity of what is done, and there'll be variation in the outcome. So any methodology that doesn't capture variation is going to miss most of the point. And in addition, this particular methodology has a very, very strict requirement that there be no changes in the intervention. And therefore, learning by doing, which is at the center of many of our philosophies and practices, learning by doing is strictly forbidden. So this it's not shocking that then, if you take this into account, that often the results of what gets measured by this approach turns out to lead up to relatively little. But there's an even deeper problem with this particular methodology, which is, and this is really where the devil is in the details, and this is an issue that has gotten less attention Much of the debate over RCTs, it can be philosophical, it can be political, but this particular critique, which is summed up in the blog that was linked at the beginning, that mysteriously somehow 3IE agreed to publish, is that the indicators that they choose are not really indicators of the work we're doing. They're indicators that are so indirect often that there's no relationship with what is actually going on. And so it's extremely important to not believe that the headline or the abstract actually reflects what is in the study. Because the details of what is actually measured, the nature of the indicators, is buried deep in the annexes, which are often not even in the published version of the article, which may or may not have a link to the online appendices. And so it's less than transparent, let's put it that way. And so the result then plays into what I would argue is a conflict of interest often between many different approaches to research and approaches to action, which is the main priority of the researcher is to get published in a prestigious journal to move their career forward. The overlap between that and research that is useful for activists is small to none. And therefore I respectfully disagree with some of the comments made earlier this morning that assumes that we really need to focus on getting the word out from what research says, when much of what is published as research is simply not useful. And that's separate from the question of research that is actively a threat, because it claims to document and measure what we're all doing, and it doesn't really do that. So, the additional problem posed by this dominant paradigm is that it crowds out studying other things, interventions, campaigns that are harder to measure, given the constraints of the dominant paradigms. And so I'm going to spend most of my remaining time talking about some of these crowding out effects. And one way to sum up this crowding out effect is to distinguish interventions, which have the implied baggage of being external and brief and bounded, from campaigns, which have the association of being more organic, with potential multiplier effects, with learning by doing, and so forth. So these are just 6 of many possible systems change strategies that that we might want to think about how to focus more research energy on. And these are all examples of what Anu referred to as cases where practice is still far ahead of our body of research.
So I'm not sure how many of you in the room are researchers, so I just wanted to step back and relating very much to what Jonathan Walter said, as well as what was said this morning in the plenary. One of the reasons for the perverse dynamics that have been described are that they're just very misaligned incentives reflecting the current power structure. And when we had the researcher discussion earlier today, we talked about the responsibility of researchers in trying to actively change those dynamics of the power structure. And the first of these is just that, as Jonathan noted, the most easily funded research agenda is dominated by donor priorities, which does not necessarily, in fact, probably rarely coincides with community priorities, as Walter described. And next, something we haven't mentioned that I think is really important, especially when we're talking about research that's borderline program evaluation, is the success cartel in global health. So there's this notion that, especially when you're talking about bilateral donors who are funded by taxpayer constituencies, that the program needs to be evaluated as successful, and that puts a lot of pressure on the donors and on the researchers to kind of collude in creating a narrative of success, whether or not that's appropriate. And 2, this pressure also affects the implementing NGOs, be they national or international. Third is that budgets are often very small, and researchers, maybe especially in health, are working in a soft money environment. So they're raising money for their own salaries and for their own research, and so it's very difficult to align that imperative with thinking more critically about what the priorities would be from a community perspective. Next is that, of course, in research we often forget, I think, the very fundamental fact that evidence is not the basis for policy making. And so sometimes there's real pressure for researchers to go beyond research and sort of water down what they're doing in order to accommodate those political priorities and questions. And lastly, I think it's just the notion that a lot of the so-called indicators of success in academia have very little to do with community priorities or even what would necessarily advance the agenda from a program implementation perspective. And that is mainly publication in a peer-reviewed journal. So I think this is just an example of a research agenda that is intended to advance an agenda and do the right thing, but that may have very little resonance with people working at the coalface of rights claiming in marginalized communities.
Asking the right questions, for me, is at three different levels. First is who asked the questions, and then we have who decides what question is right and which ones are not. And the third one is once you decide what's the right question, what process and methods you have in place to ensure that the approach to respond to that question maintains the participation of people. So in trying to implement this approach of maintaining communities but part of the deciding the question, then refining the question, how to implement it, in our experience is extremely challenging because what we have is a clash of paradigms. We have the paradigms of people affected by failing public services, for instance, that they have a question that they are seeking responses so they can strategize about how to resolve the service. So you can imagine that there is an urgency in that process because services are failing and they want to resolve those questions. And we can be very committed, academics, professionals, like all of us are here, that's why we are here in Copasa, but we function on the different paradigms. Our paradigm is that, okay, there is a question, so we need to have a specific approach to answer that question. And for us, the paradigm is that that approach falls into what we learn from academia, which is that you need to phrase the question in a way, you need to collect your data in a specific way, you need to fulfill certain checklists, so your peers academics, can validate that information. It's not that the community that started with the question validates. So we already start functioning with a different paradigm. It's not the community anymore. It's that we need to satisfy the paradigm of our peers because they are the ones that are going to validate the knowledge, which started because of a community question. And as I'm saying, we could be very committed, but if we are in academia, for instance, also that paradigm have a specific metrics about our performance. And our performance in most cases is not measured in terms of how many questions generated by communities you help to answer, but how many papers you publish based on that. So all of that matrix that come from different paradigms create this clash, which becomes extremely challenging process of navigating. And very briefly, I'm going to tell about how we learn about how this clash happens, and also how we learn about how to navigate that for future research. So about 6-7 years ago, with community, we agreed that the system that we had for monitoring services of pen and paper, it was not working anymore. It was taking very long, a lot of time. It takes a lot of efforts to bring the paper report to the authority. They just throw it away, saying, what document bring anything? So we decided together with communities that we should have a system that is based on real-time information. You don't have to travel, so we're going to use SMS technology. But because that would involve a lot of time for communities, they need to learn how to use the mobile phone to send SMS. They need to start trusting a system that you're sending you information and all of that. So we agree that because of that, we want to know whether using technology, using text messages, is going to generate a response from authorities. So that's the question that came from the community. They wanted to know that if now that we're going to use mobile phones, authorities are going to respond to our programs. So we converted that question together with another organization which is specialized on rigorous research about if the SMS complaint is going to trigger response from authorities. But in that process, we were interested as an organization that we want to demonstrate, generate some rigorous data so we can access to funding as well. Because the donor that was giving the money said that, okay, but we would like to do something rigorous so we can expand you with the money in case this works. So in that intention of finding rigorous approach, with the other organization, we agreed that, okay, that's an opportunity to do a short-term experiment. We can random allocate different people using mobile phones, and we can also identify whether women are more prone to send message with men, if the authority respond better to, if the complaint comes from women or from men. So if you see a lot of interesting questions that we in academia immediately want to know. But in that effort of trying to find rigorous and all of that, the questionnaire, it was 125 words. A question had to be administered by phone, which was 2 hours, 2 hours half in the interviews. And we were working on our paradigm of trying to make it as rigorous as possible, so with the idea to unlock some funding to expand in this. But that was moving away from what the community needed. They needed a way to know that our effort is just worth it. It is worth it, and authorities are responding. But they ended up in the process of having to respond to fund surveys of 2 hours and a half, and they didn't find any relevance of asking many of those questions. And all of them being volunteer, they felt we were wasting their time because they didn't ask for it. They just wanted to know whether it is working or not. And finally, in this process, that when we involve any other partner organization, we are clear that we do not lose control of the process. We can invite a very expert person organization, but still you are here to support the project. Not like we did 7 years ago when I mentioned that, okay, you have control of the design of the study, you have all the control, so communities will maintain control of the process because in the end, it's the question that was generated all of that, and it's the response to that question that should be the prime purpose of all the effort.
Okay, so what we're going to do now is we're going to break into what we call world cafes. So there are 5 groups, and I will tell you what the presenter pairs are. Each pair has 1 researcher and 1 practitioner, and they both talk of their experience of collaborating together. And they're going to respond to 3 questions. They'll present quickly at 3 questions, and I'd like to focus the discussion around these 3 questions. You can give priority to one or the other. There's no formula here. The 3 questions are, first one, what are the priority research areas for the social accountability field from your perspective, meaning from the researcher perspective and from the practitioner perspective? What are the burning questions for you? The second question is, how might researcher-practitioner partnerships work best to generate robust and relevant findings for the field? What are some of the opportunities and challenges of such partnerships? So it's all about partnering researchers with practitioners. And the third question is, what new insights and findings have been generated by such a partnership approach? Because you can do research, just researchers alone, you can do some research also by practitioners. Both models are perfectly viable and have been done, but is there a value add to this collaboration?
What makes the state respond, what types of accountability can get responded to. And what we found ourselves doing in the work in Brazil was helping an indigenous movement do an ethnography of the state. And I think in terms of what questions are we asking and are they the right ones, one of the things to factor in is who are we doing research on? Are we doing research on, in this case, indigenous people, or are we doing research on the state? Because if you're doing research on the state, helping make it less mysterious and less arbitrary, so they can understand some of the logics, however corrupt or otherwise influenced, that shape state decision making, they can strategize better. And that is a useful role that researchers can play. We can be ethnographers of our own state, if you like, if we're not indigenous ourselves.
So my main takeaway from the 2 groups that I was in was 2 things. One is that at the center of the whole thing is trust. So without trust, and that to build that trust, the relationship. So research becomes a very clinical kind of activity, but the interaction between the practitioner and the community members is establishing trust. I think that is at the core of the entire, and this should reflect in the report as well. So if there is any, like I heard in the morning session that many reports were not read. I'm sure it is because those reports don't present the humanness or the human face that community needs to, show we need to show that. So I think any report that is telling the true story will be report. So this, tandem between the researcher and the practitioner in this beautiful dance where the community is the main player and the others are facilitators. I think for me that was the main takeaway from this relationship.
It's difficult to add something on all of these insightful comments. I think the one thing that came up in our group that wasn't addressed during the panel was this notion of pushback from peer reviewers and others on a perceived conflict of interest when you're having group practitioners drive the agenda. So you can sort of, in some ways, the flip side of what Benita said, where you spoke about avoiding co-optation, or I guess maybe it's similar. There's this perception of co-optation, this perception that if practitioners are driving the agenda and involved intimately in research, then it is somehow biased towards their interest or part of that success cartel I mentioned earlier, and how to, sure, take steps to ensure that that doesn't happen, but also to underline and communicate the value of having the folks doing the work and